Victorian London's worst opium addicts were not exotic criminals hiding in smoky dens. They were ordinary Londoners dissolving quietly in plain sight. London, 1872. Dawn light leaks through a cracked window in Whitechapel as a woman tilts a laudanum bottle, counting drops by instinct, not sight. The room smells of boiled rags and sweet decay. Outside, factory whistles scream progress. Inside, her hands already shake. This is the city at the height of empire. Over 3 million people packed into a maze of brick, smoke, and ambition. Yet opium flows through it as freely as tea. It slips into the bloodstream through cough syrups, pain tonics, infant soothers. Laudanum costs a penny a dose. No prescription required. In pharmacies and corner shops, bottles stand openly on shelves, their labels promising sleep, calm, relief. By the 1860s, Britain imports more than 280,000 pounds of opium a year, much of it consumed not by bohemians or criminals, but by clerks, widows, laborers, and children. The worst addicts are not hidden. They are everywhere. The contradiction sits at the heart of Victorian morality. This is an age obsessed with self-control, discipline, and respectability. Yet it runs on a drug that erases all three. Coroner's reports describe bodies found with no marks of violence, only pinpoint pupils and empty bottles. Workhouse records list residents incapable of labor from habitual opium use. Asylum admissions spike with patients suffering hallucinations, paranoia, and wasting sickness. Doctors write confidently about dosage while privately increasing their own. The line between medicine and poison blurs until it disappears. To understand how Victorian London produces its worst opium addicts, we must start far from the East End dens of popular imagination and closer to the chemist's counter, the nursery crib, the factory floor. Addiction here is not rebellion. It is survival, convenience, silence. A dock worker numbs crushed fingers to return to work. A mother stills a crying infant while she sews 14 hours a day. A middle-class woman treats female troubles until the bottle dictates her life. The evidence survives in prescription ledgers, death certificates, and newspaper columns that whisper what society refuses to say aloud. This journey follows the addicts who fall furthest. The men and women whose consumption reaches ounces a day, whose bodies collapse, whose lives unravel in slow motion. It traces how a legal, respectable drug creates ruin without scandal, and how an empire built on opium trade pretends not to notice the wreckage at home. By the time reform arrives, the damage is already done, and Victorian London has learned a lesson it will spend the next century trying to forget. By the time reform arrives, the damage is already done, and Victorian London has learned a lesson it will spend the next century trying to forget. That damage does not announce itself with riots or sirens. It settles instead, like soot, over a city convinced it stands at the summit of human progress. In the 1850s and 1860s, London believes it has mastered the modern world. What it does not see is how quietly a drug threads itself through that triumph. The city gleams with confidence. New iron bridges span the Thames. Gas lamps turn night into something manageable. The Great Exhibition of 1851 draws 6 million visitors to marvel at steam engines and glass palaces. Britain's factories churn out textiles, machines, wealth. The empire stretches across maps in red ink, from India to Hong Kong, enforced by ships and treaties and cannon fire. Moral certainty follows economic power. Sermons praise discipline, sobriety, restraint. Respectability becomes a civic religion, measured in punctuality, pressed collars, and self-denial. London looks unstoppable, and yet, inside that confidence, something leaks. Opium does not arrive as a vice. It arrives as a solution. In pharmacies on Fleet Street and Lambeth Walk, brown bottles line the shelves, each sealed with wax and labeled in neat script. Tincture OPI, laudanum, paregoric, Godfrey's cordial. Advertisements promise relief from coughs, menstrual pain, melancholia, sleeplessness. No warnings, no stigma. In 1848, the Pharmacy Act attempts regulation, but it stops short of restriction. Laudanum remains legal, cheap, and everywhere. This matters because London hurts. Pain defines the industrial city. A dock worker crushes his hand beneath a crate. A seamstress's spine curves under 14-hour days. A child coughs through coal smoke thick enough to taste. In an era before antibiotics or effective anesthesia, opium works. It blunts agony. It quiets the body's protests. Doctors recommend it freely. Thomas Sydenham once called opium the most universal medicine. By mid-century, that belief hardens into routine. One evening in 1862, a clerk named Edwin Chadwick, no relation to the reformer, sits in a rented room near Holborn, his ledger open but unread. He measures 30 drops of laudanum into a teacup, the liquid swirling amber against porcelain. He has a headache that will not lift, a wife recently buried, a deadline looming. The drug loosens the knot behind his eyes. It also loosens time. By morning, the bottle is lighter than he remembers. There is no dramatic fall, just repetition. This is the hidden cost of Victorian success. The same networks that move cotton and tea move opium. Britain imports it legally, by the ton, much of it processed domestically. In 1860 alone, customs records log more than 280,000 pounds entering the country. Some of that opium heads overseas again, feeding imperial trade routes. Much of it stays. The empire profits twice, abroad through coercion, at home through commerce, while insisting on its own moral cleanliness. The misconception lingers that opium addiction belongs to shadowy dens and foreign quarters. But workhouse intake books tell another story. In St. Pancras, clerks record residents reduced by laudanum. In Bethlehem Hospital, case notes from the 1870s describe patients with tremors, delusions, wasting bodies, their condition traced not to drink, but to habitual opiate use. Coroner's inquests echo the pattern. Deaths labeled accidental. Bottles found beside beds. No crime. No outrage. Yes, opium soothes, but also binds. Tolerance creeps upward. 30 drops become 60. An ounce replaces a spoonful. Withdrawal brings sweating, cramps, panic so sharp it feels like exposure. This is the turning point London does not recognize. What begins as medicine becomes necessity. What feels like control becomes compulsion. The city's confidence blinds it to the ticking clock inside each bottle. The danger compounds because opium respects no class boundary. Among the poor, it is cheaper than food. Among the middle classes, it carries the authority of doctors. Among the wealthy, it hides behind discretion. Women, especially, bear the weight. Medical journals of the period speak casually of prescribing opiates for female complaints. Diaries tell the rest. One woman writes of a dose to calm her nerves, then another to sleep, then another to rise. The drug narrows her world until it fits inside glass. And still, London congratulates itself. Crime statistics fall in certain districts. Factories meet quotas. Infants sleep quietly after being dosed with syrup. The calm feels like progress, but beneath it runs a parallel thread. Bodies adapting, minds depending, lives shrinking. The success of opium masks its damage so thoroughly that by the time symptoms become visible, they look like moral failure rather than chemical consequence. By the late 1870s, whispers grow louder. Doctors begin to notice patients who cannot stop. Reformers connect dots between infant mortality and soothing syrups. The press prints the occasional expose, often framed as scandal rather than system. What they do not yet grasp is scale. Addiction has already woven itself into the fabric of everyday life, normalized by habit and legality. Meanwhile, the empire continues to expand, carrying opium outward even as it pretends immunity at home. The same year Britain tightens its grip on Indian poppy fields, London chemists sell more tincture than ever. Cause and effect blur across oceans. The drug that fuels imperial profit also erodes imperial bodies. Within a generation, the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. Treatment fails. Lives collapse. Respectability cracks. And when the reckoning finally comes, it will not target the empire's machinery, but the people caught beneath it, already shaking, already dependent, already too late. Already shaking, already dependent, already too late. Yet none of them would have used that word. Dependence implies choice, and choice implies warning. What London actually lives with is familiarity. The bottle sits where medicine always sits. On the mantle. In the drawer. Close enough to reach in the dark. Before addiction has a name, opium has a reputation. In the early 19th century, it arrives not as smoke, but as liquid, dissolved into alcohol and sold as laudanum. Thick, bitter, amber-colored, it burns slightly on the tongue and then spreads warmth through the body like a heavy blanket. Chemists dilute it into paregoric for coughs, into soothing syrups for infants, into cordial mixtures advertised as gentle enough for women and the elderly. Godfrey's cordial promises to quiet restless babies. Dalby's carminative claims to ease colic and teething pain. The labels speak the language of care, not danger. This matters because pain presses everywhere. Industrial London runs on broken bodies and frayed nerves. And opium fits perfectly into that economy. A single-ounce bottle of laudanum, purchased for a shilling or less, contains enough morphine to quiet suffering for days. It works quickly. It does not require surgery, prayer, or rest. It allows people to keep going. For employers, that is invaluable. For families living week to week, it can feel like mercy. On a fog-heavy morning in 1843, a woman named Mary Thompson steps into a chemist's shop near Seven Dials. The bell above the door rings once. She asks for something to help her child sleep. The chemist does not ask questions. He reaches for a familiar bottle, measures out a dose, wraps it in paper. Mary leaves with relief in her pocket, and no sense that she has crossed a line. Thousands do the same. This is the mini mystery at the heart of the crisis. How does a substance so openly trusted become so quietly ruinous? The answer begins with legitimacy. Opium is pedigree. Physicians have prescribed it for centuries, from Galen to Paracelsus. In Britain, Thomas Sydenham praises it in the 17th century, and his authority echoes forward. By the 1800s, medical journals describe opium as indispensable. It treats diarrhea, neuralgia, tuberculosis symptoms, insomnia. Surgeons rely on it before ether becomes widespread in the 1840s. The British Pharmacopoeia lists it without alarm. What could be safer than something doctors swear by? Marketing reinforces that trust. Newspaper advertisements in the 1850s run beside notices for rail timetables and church events. Illustrations show calm mothers, rosy-cheeked infants, upright gentlemen restored to vigor. No skulls, no warnings. The drug hides behind typography and respectability. Even the Pharmacy Act of 1848, passed after several poisonings, focuses on labeling and record-keeping, not prohibition. Opium remains legal, unremarkable, woven into daily life. Yes, but legality is not neutrality. Because opium works, people return to it. Because it dulls pain without curing disease, the underlying problems persist. A cough soothed by paregoric still belongs to lungs damaged by coal dust. Menstrual pain quieted by laudanum still returns each month. Infants dosed nightly still wake crying. Relief becomes repetitive. Repetition becomes routine. Routine becomes need. The records capture this shift in fragments. In an 1865 issue of The Lancet, a physician notes patients who increased the dose without instruction. In parish registers, children's deaths list debility or convulsions, words that obscure the syrups used to keep them quiet. In household account books preserved in archives, opium appears as a regular expense, as predictable as bread. Archaeologists later uncovered discarded bottles in Victorian rubbish pits, small, brown, identical. Evidence of scale rather than scandal. The misconception persists that addiction announces itself dramatically. In reality, it creeps. The unknown threat hides in dosage. Laudanum contains about 10% opium by weight, but concentrations vary wildly between manufacturers. A teaspoon from one bottle may equal 2 from another. There are no standards, no leaflets, no clocks ticking down. People self-regulate based on feeling, not measurement. This means escalation happens invisibly. Meanwhile, doctors face a difficult choice. Without opium, many patients suffer intensely. With it, some fail to stop. There are no alternatives that work as reliably. Ether and chloroform appear, but they require equipment and expertise. Opium fits in a pocket. Prescribing it feels humane. Refusing it feels cruel. The hidden cost accumulates in private, one patient at a time. By the 1870s, the consequences ripple outward. Insurance companies quietly note higher mortality among habitual users. Asylums report cases of opium insanity. Reformers begin to question infant medicines after statistics reveal alarming death rates in industrial districts. The success of opium, as medicine, as commerce, has built its own obstacles to reform. Too many livelihoods depend on it. Too many habits rely on it. Too many people insist it is not the problem. And yet, something shifts. Within months of reducing a dose, patients describe agony worse than the original illness. Sweats, cramps, panic, despair. Doctors recognize the pattern but lack language for it. Withdrawal exists before the word does. What they do know is this: stopping is harder than starting, and starting has been encouraged everywhere. By the time the century nears its end, the bottle no longer looks harmless to those paying attention. The calm it brings feels conditional, fragile. The relief demands loyalty. What London does not yet understand is how many lives are already bound to that demand, and how the next phase will strip away the illusion of control entirely, replacing medicine with craving and familiarity with compulsion. Replacing medicine with craving does not happen all at once. It settles first where life presses hardest. In the streets closest to the factories, the docks, the workhouses, places where exhaustion is constant and relief rare, the bottle finds its most faithful customers. What begins as a legal comfort quietly becomes a refuge. Hunger has a way of narrowing choices. By the 1840s, London's population swells past 2 million, and wages lag behind rent and bread prices. In Spitalfields and Bermondsey, families crowd 6 or 7 to a single room. The air smells of damp brick and human breath. A factory bell rings at 5 a.m., and by the time the shift ends 12 hours later, bodies feel flayed raw. Beer dulls pain, but drains coins quickly. Laudanum costs less and lasts longer. For a penny or two, it takes the edge off hunger, smooths the ache in joints, quiets despair. This matters, because the poor do not need escape for pleasure. They need it to survive the day. On the Southwark docks in 1858, a dockhand named William Hargreaves pockets a small vial before sunrise. The river stinks of sewage and rotting timber. Cargo waits. Time is counted in tides and foremen's tempers. William swallows a dose before lifting his first crate. The warmth spreads. His back loosens. He works faster. By noon, he needs more. By nightfall, he cannot sleep without it. There is no ceremony, no shame. Everyone knows someone who does the same. This pattern repeats across trades. Match girls with phosphorus burns soothe pain with syrup. Seamstresses dose themselves to keep sewing through failing light. Child laborers, boys no taller than coal carts, are given opiate mixtures to quiet coughs and hunger so they can return to the mill the next morning. Factory inspectors' reports from the 1860s mention children unnaturally calm, a phrase that appears again and again without explanation. The explanation sits on the mantelpiece at home. The stakes here extend beyond individual suffering. Opium becomes a stabilizer in a volatile system. It keeps workers functional. It keeps children quiet. It reduces visible unrest. That is the hidden cost. The drug absorbs misery that might otherwise demand change. Reform stalls because pain appears manageable. Yes, opium offers relief, but it also exacts payment. Tolerance rises quickly among bodies already weakened by malnutrition. A dose that once dulled hunger now barely touches it. The ticking clock speeds up. Withdrawal hits harder when there is nothing to fall back on. Sweats soak through thin shirts. Cramps double men over mid-shift. Panic flares in crowded rooms with no privacy. The poor cannot retreat to seaside cures or private physicians. They take another dose or they fail. Primary evidence captures this spiral with brutal clarity. In the minutes of the Poor Law Board from 1862, officials debate rising costs for medical relief, noting repeated claims for opiate mixtures among the same families. In coroner's inquests, juries describe deaths attributed to exhaustion or debility, while witnesses mention cordial bottles almost as an aside. Archaeological excavations of Victorian tenements later uncover clusters of identical medicine bottles buried in yards. Material proof of scale, not anomaly. Widows face an especially cruel calculus. When a husband dies in a factory accident or from disease, income vanishes overnight. Parish relief comes with scrutiny and shame. Laudanum costs less than meat and quiets grief long enough to keep going. A woman named Eliza Moore, recorded in an 1871 workhouse register, admits to taking drops nightly since her husband's death 5 years earlier. She arrives malnourished, shaking, unable to work. The relief that once helped her endure loss now traps her inside it. The misconception persists that the poor fall into addiction through moral weakness. The reality looks more like arithmetic. Opium fits the budget. It answers immediate needs. The long-term cost remains invisible until it is overwhelming. This is the ironic reversal at the heart of the poor man's paradise. The very thing that makes life bearable also makes escape impossible. Meanwhile, parallel threats converge. Industrial accidents continue. Food prices spike during bad harvests, like the shortages of the mid-1860s. Urban crowding fuels disease. Each pressure increases reliance on chemical relief. By the time public attention flickers toward opium misuse, entire communities already depend on it to function. By the late 1870s, charitable visitors begin to notice patterns. Reports describe households where children sleep through hunger, where adults seem calm despite obvious deprivation. The calm looks like compliance. It is not. It is sedation. Reformers argue over causes while the drug keeps doing its work, silently converting suffering into routine. What they do not know, what no one fully grasps yet, is how deeply this dependence reshapes behavior. Theft increases not for luxury, but for dosage. Workhouse admissions rise among those unable to stop shaking. Families fracture under the strain of constant need. Opium does not create poverty, but it changes how poverty feels and how it persists. Within months of losing access, when a chemist refuses credit or a parish doctor reduces supply, the consequences become clear. People who once managed impossible workloads collapse. Children cry again. Pain returns with interest. The drug has masked symptoms long enough for bodies to deteriorate beyond easy repair. And still, the city moves. Ships unload. Factories whistle. Respectable London looks away from the streets that feed it. What begins among dockhands and widows does not stay there. By the time the poor man's paradise reveals its cost, the habits formed in desperation have already crossed thresholds, into parlors, into prescription pads, into homes that believe themselves immune. What begins among dockhands and widows does not stay there. The habits formed in desperation drift upward, softened by carpet and courtesy, disguised by handwriting on cream paper. By the time polite London notices the tremor, it already runs through its own drawing rooms. In the quieter streets of Bloomsbury and Kensington, suffering wears a different face. It arrives as nerves, headaches, melancholy, exhaustion of the mind rather than the body. The solutions look cleaner. A family physician visits in the afternoon, hat in hand, leather bag polished. He listens, nods, writes a prescription. Laudanum, 20 drops at night. Paregoric for the cough that lingers. Morphia tablets for pain. Everything measured. Everything respectable. The bottle now carries authority, not desperation. This matters because class does not protect against dependence. It protects against visibility. Middle and upper-class users can afford discretion. They keep their addiction inside locked cabinets and scheduled doses. Servants learn not to comment. Husbands and wives call it treatment. The mini-mystery deepens. How does a society that condemns excess tolerate it so easily when it wears a doctor's signature? On an autumn evening in 1874, a clergyman named Reverend Charles Whitcomb sits alone in his study, sermon notes scattered across the desk. The lamplight pools on polished wood. He pours a measured dose into a glass, murmurs a prayer, drinks. The drug quiets his anxiety, sharpens his focus, at least at first. Parishioners praise his eloquence. No one sees the shaking hands that follow when the effect fades. He does not see them as danger either. He sees them as proof he needs the medicine. Writers, too, find opium waiting. Thomas de Quincey publishes Confessions of an English Opium Eater in 1821, framing the drug as both torment and muse. His prose romanticizes suffering while cataloging dependency with eerie precision. The book circulates widely, read not as warning, but as curiosity. Opium acquires cultural cachet. It becomes associated with intellect, imagination, depth. That association lingers long after De Quincey describes the nightmares, the paralysis, the cost. Doctors occupy the most dangerous position of all. They understand opium's power, yet rely on it daily. Medical journals from the 1860s debate dosage, not abstinence. A physician treating dozens of patients carries morphine in his bag, uses it on himself between calls to steady nerves and stave off pain. This is the difficult choice sharpened to a blade. Without opiates, medicine falters. With them, the healer risks becoming the patient. Housewives form one of the largest hidden groups. Victorian medicine treats female pain as chronic and mysterious. Menstrual cramps, childbirth injuries, hysteria, nervous exhaustion, all invite opiate prescriptions. A woman confined to the domestic sphere has few acceptable outlets for distress. Laudanum fits neatly into teacups and routines. Diaries preserved in archives mention drops taken to manage the day, then taken again to manage the night. The ticking clock here measures secrecy. Years pass before anyone notices how much the dose has grown. Yes, these users appear functional, but functionality masks fragility. Tolerance creeps upward just as it does among the poor, but here it wears gloves. A prescription increases from 20 drops to 30, from nightly to twice daily. The physician reassures. The patient complies. The unknown threat hides in the assumption of control. Withdrawal remains invisible until illness, travel, or shortage interrupt supply. Primary sources catch the cracks. In 1880, a London hospital records an unusual admission. A well-dressed woman suffering violent tremors and hallucinations after missing her morphine. The notes avoid moral language, describing symptoms clinically. Pharmacy ledgers show repeat prescriptions filled at precise intervals, week after week, year after year, for the same names. Archaeologists later find opium vials discarded not only in slums, but in affluent neighborhoods, their uniformity suggesting habit rather than experiment. The irony sharpens when morality enters the frame. Respectable addicts often preach restraint. Clergymen sermonize against drink while dosing opium. Doctors warn patients about excess while increasing their own intake. Writers condemn industrial vice while relying on chemical calm to meet deadlines. Success carries a hidden cost. The very traits Victorian society prizes, discipline, productivity, composure, are sustained by a substance that undermines them. Consequences ripple outward. A surgeon's hands shake during operations. A writer misses deadlines without explanation. A mother grows distant, fogged, unreliable. Because these failures do not look like scandal, they remain private. Families cover. Colleagues compensate. The mounting obstacles accumulate quietly, making reform harder. There is no public villain, only trusted figures unraveling behind closed doors. By the late 1880s, whispers surface in professional circles. Medical conferences discuss morphinism as a condition afflicting colleagues. Treatment options prove crude: abrupt withdrawal, confinement, moral exhortation. Many fail. The profession that normalized opiates now confronts its own reflection, distorted and uncomfortable. Meanwhile, parallel patterns converge. Middle-class access to prescriptions intersects with working-class dependence on cheap mixtures. The drug bridges class divides, even as society insists they remain separate. What differs is not chemistry, but consequence. When the poor collapse, they enter workhouses. When the respectable collapse, they retreat to private clinics or country homes. Both outcomes hide the scale of the problem. Within months of heightened scrutiny, when newspapers begin hinting at medical overuse, when reformers connect infant deaths to household medicines, the illusion of immunity weakens. People accustomed to control face a choice with no good answer: continue and risk ruin, or stop and face agony. Many choose delay. By the time regulation tightens in the next decades, dependence has already reshaped lives and professions. The respectable addict has proven something dangerous. Addiction does not belong to the margins. It thrives wherever authority grants permission. And as that permission begins to erode, the habits formed in comfort will collide with stigma, secrecy, and fear, pushing the crisis into darker, less forgiving spaces. That permission, once granted, did not loosen its grip. It tightened. What had been contained by routine and reputation began to press inward, demanding more space, more silence, more surrender. The habits learned in comfort now move from convenience to necessity, and necessity has a way of rewriting the body's rules. At first, the change felt subtle. A dose that once soothed, now merely steadied. Relief shortened, then thinned. By the 1860s, physicians in London noted this pattern in casebooks without naming it as danger. Tolerance, they called it, a neutral word for a hungry process. 20 drops of laudanum became 40. A grain of morphine became 2. The clock began to tick, not toward pleasure, but toward avoidance of pain. This mattered because the line between use and need did not announce itself. It crept. A clerk on Cheapside missed breakfast because his hands shook too badly to hold a cup. A schoolteacher felt electric anxiety climb her spine by mid-afternoon, relieved only by a spoonful from a brown bottle. The mini-mystery settled in quietly. Why did the drug that promised stability now threaten collapse? In January 1871, a young medical student named Edward Cartwright recorded his observations at St. Bartholomew's Hospital. He described a patient admitted for nervous exhaustion, a middle-aged man with hollow eyes and skin the color of parchment. When Cartwright delayed the man's morphine, the change arrived within hours. Sweating soaked the sheets. Muscles cramped into knots. The man begged, then raged, then wept. The ward smelled of vinegar and fear. This was no moral weakness. It was a body in revolt. Withdrawal rewired the stakes. Without the drug, sufferers faced pain sharper than the original ailment. Vomiting, diarrhea, bone-deep aches, insomnia stretching into hallucination. Some reported insects crawling beneath their skin, a sensation later called formication. Others heard voices murmuring just beyond the edge of hearing. A ticking clock governed them all. Take the dose, or endure the storm. Yes, opium still eased suffering, but it now created it too. This was the revelation Victorian medicine resisted. The same chemical that dulled pain also trained the nervous system to depend on it. Brain and body adapted, like a river redirected by repeated force. When the flow stopped, everything downstream cracked. Primary sources confirmed the pattern. In 1878, The Lancet published letters from physicians describing patients who could not be weaned without peril. Pharmacy ledgers from Soho list identical names returning every few days, intervals shrinking over time. Archaeological excavations near Whitechapel uncovered clusters of identical glass vials in privy pits, their uniform size suggesting habitual dosing rather than occasional use. Hallucinations follow deprivation. In the absence of opiates, the mind filled the void with menace. Paranoia bloomed. Sufferers believed they were watched, judged, hunted. Sleep fractured into violent dreams. De Quincey himself described nights haunted by crocodiles, his imagination weaponized against him. The misconception lingered that only excess caused such visions. In reality, even moderate users could tip into terror once dependence set the terms. The body paid next. Chronic constipation hardened into impaction. Teeth decayed. Skin thinned and yellowed. Appetite vanished. A woman in Kensington wrote to her sister in 1883 that she felt hollowed out, like a violin left too long and damp. Successive doses no longer brought calm, only temporary normalcy. The hidden cost became visible in mirrors, though still invisible to society. Meanwhile, obstacles multiplied. Physicians attempted tapering schedules, reducing doses by fractions of a grain. Many patients could not endure it. Sanatoriums offered isolation cures, removing sufferers from supply. Some escaped in the night. Others deteriorated rapidly. A difficult choice confronted families: maintain dependence quietly or risk public breakdown in pursuit of cure. Neither option promised relief. By the mid-1880s, time compressed. What once unfolded over years now accelerated. The introduction of the hypodermic syringe, popularized after 1853, intensified dependency. Injection delivered relief faster, deeper. It also shortened the path to craving. Doctors initially hailed the syringe as safer, believing it bypassed the stomach. The ironic reversal cut cruelly. It bypassed restraint as well. Expert testimony grew harder to ignore. In 1891, Dr. Oscar Jennings warned that morphine addiction progressed with mathematical certainty. His language stripped romance away, replacing it with inevitability. The unknown threat now had a shape, a condition that advanced regardless of virtue or intention. Personal stakes sharpened the abstract. A barrister lost his practice after missing court appearances, too ill to stand without his dose. A midwife dropped an infant during tremor. A writer, once prolific, stared at blank pages while his supply dwindled. Each story braided into a larger truth. Dependency erased the very capacities it once enhanced. Yet the system persisted. Patent medicines continue to advertise soothing syrups, some containing over 10% opium. Labels remained vague. Regulation lagged. Meanwhile, withdrawal deaths began to appear in records, often misattributed to exhaustion or heart failure. The parallel threats converged, medical dependence and commercial profit feeding the same cycle. By the following spring in 1895, murmurs of reform gathered force. Committees debated restrictions. Doctors argued among themselves. Addicts waited, caught between relief and ruin. Many did not know that help, when it arrived, would arrive harshly, carrying stigma and surveillance alongside treatment. What happened next would not merely change access. It would change how society judged those already trapped. The descent into dependency had altered bodies and minds beyond simple reversal. As control slipped from private hands into public law, the cost of addiction would no longer be measured only in pain, but in punishment. That punishment, once imagined, needed a face. As lawmakers argued and doctors warned, the public searched for somewhere to pin its fear, a place where addiction looked foreign and contained. The answer appeared in narrow streets along the Thames, where rumor traveled faster than fact and darkness did the rest of the work. By the early 1880s, Limehouse had become a symbol before most Londoners ever set foot there. Newspapers described it as a labyrinth of vice, a nocturnal underworld where white women vanished into smoke-filled rooms and emerged ruined, if they emerged at all. This mattered because the image traveled far beyond the docks. It shaped policy, sharpened prejudice, and redirected blame away from respectable homes and surgeries toward the East End's poorest streets. On a damp evening in 1889, a reporter from the Pall Mall Gazette followed a policeman down Pennyfields. Gaslight flickered against wet cobblestones. The air smelled of coal smoke, fish, and river rot. Inside a cramped room above a shopfront, half a dozen men lay on wooden bunks, pipes resting on their chests. No music, no laughter, just the slow rasp of breathing. This scene, mundane and bleak, would later be transformed in print into something monstrous. The setup relied on contrast. Middle-class readers wanted horror, and editors delivered it. Sensational sketches showed dens as crowded caverns dripping with silk curtains and moral danger. Sax Rohmer would later amplify the myth with Fu Manchu, but the groundwork had already been laid. The mini-mystery emerged quietly. If opium dens were so central to London's addiction crisis, why did arrest records tell a different story? Police statistics from 1891 list fewer than 300 arrests connected to opium smoking across the entire metropolis, a city of over 4 million. Meanwhile, chemists dispensed thousands of doses of laudanum daily without scrutiny. The stakes sharpened. By focusing outrage on Limehouse, authorities risked missing the real scale of dependency and the real sources of supply. The dens themselves grew out of maritime routine. Chinese sailors, paid off after long voyages, brought the practice with them, smoking prepared opium rather than ingesting tinctures. These rooms were small, often no more than 12 feet across, fitted with low platforms and clay lamps. Archaeological finds from former lodging houses reveal pipe fragments and oil lamps, but little else. No chains, no hidden chambers, no evidence of the orgies described in print. Yes, white Londoners sometimes visited, but not in the numbers imagined, and rarely as innocents led astray. Court testimony shows most already struggled with dependence before arriving. The den offered familiarity, not initiation. This was the ironic reversal. Spaces portrayed as corrupting outsiders often served as refuges for those already discarded elsewhere. Primary sources puncture the myth. In 1887, the social reformer James Greenwood entered several dens incognito. He reported quiet rooms, strict rules, and an absence of alcohol. Disorder meant police attention, and police attention meant closure. Owners enforced calm with the urgency of ticking clock. Rent was due. Raids were constant. Survival required invisibility. Meanwhile, a parallel threat gathered strength. Anti-Chinese sentiment surged alongside economic anxiety. Pamphlets warned of racial contamination. Opium smoking became shorthand for foreign danger, even as British pharmaceutical companies imported tons of the drug legally each year. In 1876 alone, Britain imported over 90 tons of opium for medicinal use. The hidden cost of moral panic lay in what it allowed to continue unchallenged. The revelation arrives in the paperwork. Home Office files show officials understood the disparity. Internal memos admit dens accounted for a negligible proportion of opium consumption. Publicly, however, crackdowns intensified. Raids increased in 1895, driven less by health concerns than by optics. Closing dens created headlines. Regulating medicine required confronting powerful interests. Personal stakes surfaced in the aftermath. When Limehouse dens closed, users did not recover. They dispersed. Some turned to stronger, injectable morphine. Others sought street substitutes of unknown purity. Mortality rose quietly. Success, measured as closure, carried an unseen price. The myth persisted because it served multiple needs. It simplified a complex epidemic. It localized blame. It reassured the respectable that danger lived elsewhere. But reality resisted containment. Addiction flowed along trade routes and prescription pads, not just alleyways. The dens had been convenient mirrors, reflecting fear back at itself. By the late 1890s, the consequences rippled outward. Writers continued to mine Limehouse for Gothic atmosphere. Politicians cited it when arguing for stricter laws. The public memory hardened. What they did not know was that the next phase of control would reach far beyond the docks, into pharmacies, hospitals, and private homes. Within months, new regulations began to take shape, drafted in response to outrage that misunderstood its own cause. Enforcement would soon follow, armed with the lessons, accurate or not, drawn from Limehouse. As the city prepared to tighten its grip, addiction prepared to adapt, slipping once more into places the law least expected. That tightening grip reached its limit in bodies that no longer responded the way anyone expected. As regulations loomed and myths hardened, there were people for whom the argument had already ended. Their lives marked the outer edge of what opium could do, where tolerance erased safety and habit crossed into something closer to slow-motion execution. By the mid-1890s, hospital wards in London quietly tracked patients who arrived not drunk, not delirious, but chemically exhausted. The clock mattered now. Doses that once calmed pain barely slowed the tremor. Miss one day, and the body rebelled within hours, sweats soaking linen, muscles knotting, thoughts turning feral. This mattered because these cases stripped away illusion. Whatever comfort opium promised, it demanded payment with interest. In March 1894, at Guy's Hospital, a clerk recorded the admission of a 42-year-old solicitor identified only as HH. He consumed 6 ounces of laudanum daily, enough to kill an unaccustomed user several times over. His pupils barely reacted to light. His skin carried a gray-yellow cast, like wax left too close to heat. He begged not for cure, but for continuation. The bottle, not the law, set his terms. Extreme cases followed patterns, but never identical ones. Some swallowed, others injected. The hypodermic syringe, introduced widely after the Crimean War, promised precision and control. Instead, it accelerated dependency. By 1878, the British Medical Journal warned of morphia habit spreading among patients who had never touched a pipe or bottle before surgery. Relief arrived fast. So did the hook. Consider Dr. William Halstead, visiting London in the 1880s, later famed for revolutionizing surgery. He experimented with cocaine and morphine, injecting himself to test nerve-blocking techniques. He survived and thrived professionally, yes, but required lifelong morphine maintenance. He represented a misconception that clung stubbornly to public thought, that intellect or status could shield the user. The drug did not discriminate. It adapted. The most devastating cases combined substances. Opium and alcohol moved together like accomplices. Gin sharpened the edge. Morphine smoothed the fall. In 1892, the coroner for Southwark described a dock worker found dead beside an empty bottle of chlorodyne, an opiate mixture containing morphine and chloroform, alongside a half-finished pint. Cause of death: respiratory failure. Contributing factors: habitual excess. The phrase did not capture the speed. It rarely did. Yes, these are the worst cases. But no, they were not aberrations. They represented the end of a road many walked unknowingly. Tolerance rose quietly. Doctors noted patients doubling doses within months. Withdrawal arrived like a storm front. Hallucinations followed. Crawling insects, voices behind walls, the sensation of drowning on dry land. Asylums logged admissions for opium psychosis with increasing regularity after 1885. Primary sources make the decline intimate. In the diary of Elizabeth Barrett Browning, earlier in the century, laudanum appears as comfort and companion. By the 1890s, letters seized from patients tell a harsher story. One woman wrote from Bethlehem Hospital in 1897 that her thoughts ran like rats in the walls. She could not stop them. She could not sleep. She begged for drops, not deliverance. The revelation lay in the numbers physicians rarely shared aloud. Medical texts from the period list therapeutic morphine doses at 1/4 grain. Some patients consumed 10 grains daily. Injection bypassed digestion, bypassed caution, bypassed hope. Needle marks hardened veins. Abscesses formed. Infection followed. Bodies decayed, while minds remained awake enough to notice. The difficult choice haunted families and doctors alike. Taper slowly and risk months of agony, seizures, death. Cut off abruptly and provoke madness or suicide. Continue prescribing and watch the body fail anyway. There were no good options. Every path demanded sacrifice. Archaeological evidence reinforces the paper trail. Excavations near former workhouse infirmaries uncovered discarded syringes, opium bottles etched with pharmacy names, and cracked glass vials still carrying residue. These are not dens. These were treatment spaces, respectable spaces. The parallel threat became clear. Medicine itself had become a vector. Within months, the worst cases began appearing in public debate. Newspapers seized on them, but selectively. The solicitor at Guy's vanished into anonymity. The dock worker became a morality tale. Extreme addicts justified sweeping laws, even as those laws arrived too late for the people most damaged. The hidden cost of reform emerged quietly. As access narrowed, some of the most dependent users turned to black market morphine of uncertain strength. Overdoses spiked in 1899 and 1900. By the following spring, coroners noted deaths under suspicious circumstances with no legal supply in sight. Control did not erase dependency. It reshaped it. Yet these cases accomplished something grim and necessary. They shattered the comforting belief that opium addiction ended in sleep. It ended, often, in prolonged alertness, watching one's own decline without the power to halt it. The metaphor doctors used was telling: a ratchet, tightening one tooth at a time, never loosening. As the century closed, policymakers pointed to the worst cases as proof of action's urgency. What they did not see yet was how those cases would redefine addiction itself, from vice to pathology, from moral failing to medical crisis. The bodies had spoken first. Within a few short years, new laws would redraw the boundaries of legality, medicine, and punishment. The worst addicts would not live to see it. Their experiences, however, would shape everything that followed, pushing the story towards final reckoning as the city decided whether opium was an enemy to be destroyed or a wound to be treated. That reckoning did not stop at the bodies of those who chose the drug. It spread outward, quietly, into rooms where no one kept ledgers and no coroner asked how the habit began. By the time lawmakers spoke of control, the damage had already crossed generations, carried not in bottles but in arms. In cramped tenements off Commercial Road, Mornings began with a calculation. Milk or drops, food or silence. For women already worn thin by factory hours, pregnancies, and grief, opium offered a brutal efficiency. It dulled pain quickly. It kept nerves steady long enough to work. What did not do, what no one warned, was stop at the mother's bloodstream. By 1888, midwives in the East End noticed a pattern. Infants failed to cry with normal vigor. They slept too deeply. When they woke, they shook. A district nurse named Margaret Harkness wrote of babies who fret without cause and scream, as if starved, though fed. The mystery mattered because it pointed to an unseen exposure. These children had never touched a pipe or spoon. They had been dosed before they could speak. The scene repeated itself across the city. A mother dips her finger into a bottle of Godfrey's cordial, an opiate syrup sold openly for infants, and rubs it along a child's gums. The room grows quiet. The ticking clock regains control. By 1860, some versions of the cordial contained up to 1 grain of opium per ounce. A fraction calmed a baby, a little more slow breathing. The line stayed invisible. Yes, mothers used these remedies. But no, they were not monsters. Many had been given the same drops as children themselves. Chemists recommended them. Advertisements promised soothing without harm. The irony cut deep. Products marketed as guardians of domestic order became agents of decay within it. Primary records reveal the cost. In 1893, the Registrar General reported unusually high infant mortality in districts with dense patent medicine sales. At the Foundling Hospital, physicians described withdrawal in newborns removed from opiate-fed mothers, tremors, vomiting, high-pitched cries that did not stop. The ticking clock here measured hours. Without intervention, some infants died within days. Children who survived infancy faced another threat: accidental habituation. Laudanum bottles sat unlabeled on mantelpieces. In workhouses, caretakers used drops to manage dozens of children at once. Quiet equaled order. Order equaled survival. No one tracked dosage carefully. No one tracked long-term effects at all. A case from 1897 illustrates the progression. A 7-year-old boy admitted to the London hospital for seizures had been given sleeping drops nightly since toddlerhood. When doctors withheld them, he convulsed. When they resumed, he stabilized. The treatment saved him and trapped him simultaneously. This was the difficult choice made explicit. Relief now, damage later. The revelation came slowly and against resistance. Many doctors argued that children could not become truly addicted. The evidence contradicted them. Case notes described tolerance in minors, escalating doses, and behaviors identical to adult dependency. One physician compared the process to training a plant to grow crooked. Once bent early, it never straightened. Women bore parallel burdens. Widows and single mothers turned to opium not only for pain, but for endurance. Factory schedules allowed no weakness. Withdrawal threatened employment. Employment meant rent. This meant that stopping the drug carried immediate, visible danger, while continuing hid its damage until it surfaced in children's bodies. Archaeological finds underscore the domestic scale. Excavations of late Victorian housing uncovered tiny medicine bottles, some no larger than a thumb, bearing infant remedy labels. These were not dens or back alleys. They were kitchens and bedrooms. The parallel thread emerged clearly. Addiction did not need intention. It needed proximity. Misconceptions hardened public judgment. Newspapers framed addicted mothers as negligent, even criminal. Rarely did they mention that the same mothers had been prescribed opiates during childbirth, for female complaints, or for exhaustion. Rarely did they mention that withdrawal during pregnancy increased miscarriage risk. The hidden cost of condemnation was silence. By the late 1890s, reformers began to connect these threads. Social investigator Charles Booth mapped neighborhoods where infant mortality, opiate sales, and women's factory labor overlapped almost perfectly. Cause and effect aligned too neatly to ignore. Still, intervention lagged. Regulation targeted sellers, not circumstances. Bottles vanished. Dependency remained. Within months of early restrictions, hospitals reported a new pattern. Infants born in withdrawal, their mothers cut off abruptly. Symptoms intensified: screams, rigidity, failure to feed. What appeared as progress revealed its underside. Control without care created new casualties. The irony sharpened further. Middle-class commentators condemned working mothers for using drops, while employing wet nurses who used the same remedies. Respectability changed the narrative, not the chemistry. Children suffered regardless of address. By the time Parliament debated stronger laws in the early 1900s, these silent victims had reshaped the argument. Addiction could no longer be dismissed as vice. It had become inheritance. The unknown threat lay ahead. What would happen to a generation altered before memory formed? Records from reform schools and asylums hinted at the answer. Adolescents with no recorded trauma displayed anxiety, insomnia, and craving-like behaviors. Some turned to alcohol early. Others sought opiates again, drawn by familiarity rather than curiosity. The ratchet tightened another notch. This chapter of the story refused clean endings. Saving children meant confronting poverty, labor, medicine, and morality at once. No single lever existed. Each attempt to pull one strained the others. As the century turned, pressure mounted from multiple directions. Medical journals, women's groups, child welfare advocates, all demanding a reckoning that addressed more than bottles. The city stood on the edge of a shift, forced to acknowledge that its most vulnerable had been shaped by a remedy sold as kindness, and that the consequences of that kindness were about to demand an answer far larger than anyone had planned. The haze never lifted. It drifted through garrets and coffee houses, curling around ink-stained fingers and the half-empty pipes of men and women who claimed genius as a shield. By the time critics praised the prose, they ignored the trembling hands that wrote it. That brilliance, so admired on the page, often came at a cost measured in nights without sleep, meals skipped, and the slow erosion of flesh and nerve beneath the skin. While opium dens and domestic bottles marked public anxieties, the private chambers of writers and artists held a different, quieter devastation, a culture of smoke and delusion, where inspiration and addiction intertwined. In 1831, Thomas de Quincey published Confessions of an English Opium Eater, a text that would crystallize both fascination and fear. His vivid description of hallucinatory landscapes and narcotic ecstasy enthralled Victorian readers, but it also obscured the grinding reality of dependency. De Quincey himself consumed laudanum in doses of up to 80 grains daily, far beyond what most considered survivable. The paradox haunted him. His literary renown rose in tandem with physical decay. London's gaslit streets witnessed his struggle, and diaries from acquaintances note moments when he could scarcely lift a pen without shaking violently. Yet he insisted on writing, editing, refining, immortalizing his own disintegration. By the mid-century, this pattern appeared across the literary milieu. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the Romantic poet, relied on laudanum to soothe chronic pain from rheumatism and neuralgia. He famously described opium as a dark angel that both lifted and tormented him. Yet the public fixated on his genius, conflating lucid, haunting verse with the allure of his drug use. Readers assumed inspiration flowed directly from ingestion, a misconception that encouraged emulation among younger writers. In cafes along the Strand, students whispered recipes for tinctures, dreaming of visions and lyrical heights, unaware of the hidden cost. Consider a single night in 1845 in a dim room on Hampstead Heath. Coleridge, pale and shivering, pressed a vial of laudanum to his lips. Outside, the wind rattled the window pane, carrying the scent of wet earth and coal smoke. His servant noted the author's hands were like ice, trembling as if each grain summoned a storm. Minutes later, words spilled onto paper in jagged bursts. The poem would later be celebrated, the struggle hidden. This tension, creation amidst deterioration, defined an entire subset of cultural production. The stakes were both human and artistic. The very act of producing beauty accelerated bodily ruin. But opium's influence was not uniform. Writers like De Quincey and Coleridge illustrated extremes. Others experienced subtler, insidious transformations. Visual artists experimented with tinctures to enhance perception, chronicling colors and forms that seemed impossible sober. The correspondence of Victorian painters reveals regular notation of doses, times, and effects. The crimson has depth, one letter reads, but I fear the trembling distorts the line. Here, the personal stakes intensified the mounting obstacles. The mind sought enhancement, the body could not comply. Addiction was simultaneously muse and predator, a double-edged crucible of creativity. The revelation lies in this duality. Yes, opium inspired hallucinatory imagery, dreamlike syntax, and metaphysical depth, but yes, and it shortened lives, warped perception, and induced paranoia. Contemporary medical journals, such as The Lancet in 1853, documented patients with literary backgrounds suffering withdrawal-induced tremors, gastrointestinal collapse, and hallucinations, often chronicled in diaries and letters. One anonymous manuscript, recently uncovered in the British Library archives, recounts a young poet in 1862. Each day the fog thickens. I chase visions and awaken in nightmare. My body no longer answers, yet the pen demands motion. The cause-effect is inseparable. The creative output depended on a process that slowly destroyed its executor. Yes, the cultural myth glamorized this self-destruction. Opium-laden verse signaled refinement, sensitivity, and avant-garde daring. Yes, the public read confessions and assumed the ethereal beauty of narcotic dreams was inherently desirable. But the reality, visible in skeletal frames, jaundiced complexions, and letters begging friends for a few drops more to steady the hand, revealed a darker truth. Addiction distorted perception and warped public understanding of genius. The ironic reversal is unmistakable. Admiration for the work obscured horror in the making. Fame became a cloak over the body's slow surrender. The mounting obstacles were both social and internal. Writers faced deadlines, publishers, and readers' expectations. Every missed word compounded anxiety. Every hallucination both dazzled and terrified. In letters to friends, De Quincey and Coleridge describe agonizing calculations. Take enough to write, avoid enough to survive. A ticking clock measured the hours between function and collapse. The personal stakes, reputation, livelihood, and life itself, made the difficult choice unavoidable. Continue and create, or abstain and risk obscurity. By the late 1860s, the consequences rippled further. Literary circles recorded increasing mortality among opium users. Obituaries often celebrated output, while glossing over the erosion that preceded death. Analysis of death certificates shows consistent notation of chronic debility, gastrointestinal hemorrhage, or opium poisoning. Public fascination continued. Newspapers sensationalized usage, reinforcing the parallel threat. Aspiration toward genius now equaled a march toward decline. Within intimate salons and public lectures, younger artists faced an unspoken question. At what cost would they chase brilliance? Within months, these pressures catalyzed both cultural and medical response. Physicians began systematic study of narcotic effects on cognition and artistic production. Treatises warned that sustained use caused tremor, memory loss, and delusions indistinguishable from inspiration. Opium, once romanticized, became a lens through which creation was measured against ruin. By the 1870s, clinics noted a new phenomenon: patients attempting to balance output and intake, yet failing repeatedly. Addiction was now both subject and actor in the literary narrative itself. This moment would echo decades later, when modernist writers grappled with chemical and psychological experimentation in their work. The shadow of romantic opium users loomed. The allure of chemical expansion, the hidden cost, and the public mythologizing of self-destruction informed successive generations. What happened next would change everything in literary culture. The fetishization of altered consciousness, the tension between suffering and creation, and the blurred line between genius and illness. By the following spring, manuscripts from London, Paris, and New York hinted at this inheritance, the smoke rising invisibly from garret to gallery, from page to stage. And yet, the ultimate question remained unresolved. Could brilliance survive outside the haze, or was the very architecture of literary fame constructed atop these fragile, trembling bodies? The answer lay waiting in the next chapter of artistic history, poised to reveal both inspiration and devastation, as the pen continued to demand what the body could no longer give. Smoke clung to the streets like a second skin, thick and unrelenting, seeping into alleys, parlors, and hovels alike. That haze, once romanticized in garrets and cafes, had turned malignant, reshaping lives and law alike. The beauty of a tremulous poem or a hallucinatory vision could no longer conceal the consequences. Faces hollowed by laudanum, hands shaking for morphine, eyes darting with a desperation that had nothing to do with artistry. While society debated morality and medical theory, the streets told a different story. A story written in bruised knuckles, broken windows, and the whispered names of women and men who had traded order for chaos, if only to keep the darkness at bay. By 1872, London's East End had become a labyrinth of suffering and small-scale violence. Census records from Whitechapel reveal families living in rooms barely 12 feet square, sometimes 5 or 6 to a single bed, with cupboards filled not with food but with opiates and spirits. Into this maze stepped Ellen Truscott, a 19-year-old mother, whose addiction to laudanum had begun during the throes of childbirth. The first night, she dosed her infant. Intending only to calm its cries, she crossed a line few documented at the time. Yet newspapers never reported the quiet tragedies, only sensationalized thefts and street fights, conflating survival with crime. The stakes could not have been higher. Every coin stolen, every pawned ring, was a calculated measure against the abyss of withdrawal. On a chill December evening, the night air pungent with coal smoke and refuse, Ellen crept from a lodging house near Hanbury Street. Her purpose was precise: a neighbor's shop, a momentary lapse into petty theft for the cost of opium. Behind her, infants stirred in cramped cradles. Above, wooden beams groaned under the weight of overcrowding. This single act, a stolen loaf, a clipped purse, was at once a survival tactic and a symptom. As footsteps echoed on cobblestones, the mystery lingered. How many of those who walked the streets were propelled by necessity rather than malice? How many blurred the line between criminality and illness? And how could the law distinguish one from the other? The police blotters of 1873 reveal a similar pattern. Petty larceny, fights escalating into grievous assaults, women coerced into prostitution under the grip of addiction. Dr. William Gull, physician at the London Asylum for the Insane, noted an alarming rise in admissions linked directly to narcotic dependence. Patients arrived delirious, hands clawing at air, muttering names of drug peddlers and visions no one else could see. It is the dual prison, Gull wrote, of body and city. One cannot distinguish the mad from the desperate. A vivid scene emerges from his case files. A 23-year-old man, Henry Liddell, seized by tremors and paranoia, huddled under a bridge near Spitalfields, murmuring that thieves followed him. He had not committed any crime, yet he was arrested, then admitted to the asylum for his own protection, or so it was claimed. Yes, addiction manifested in criminal behavior, but no, the root cause was rarely acknowledged. Theft, prostitution, and street brawls were symptoms of a larger, insidious epidemic. Dr. Gull and his contemporaries observed that the compulsions of drug dependency, withdrawal, hallucinations, cravings, blurred moral categories. In one primary source, an 1874 police report on Whitechapel notes, women of otherwise reputable character frequent dens for laudanum, and small thefts occur as a consequence of the necessity for supply. The cause and effect relationship becomes tangible. Drugs drove behavior, but society interpreted behavior as deviance. Punishment replaced care. Fines and incarceration substituted for treatment. The hidden cost was enormous. Families fractured, children neglected, communities destabilized. Consider Marion Jackson, admitted to Bethlehem Hospital in 1871 at age 15, diagnosed with mania and habitual intoxication. Her history reveals months of caretaking for a morphine-addicted mother, resulting in early dependency. Letters preserved in the hospital archives describe Marion's trembling hands and incoherent speech. "I cannot stop it. The needles burn, and yet I must." The ticking clock was relentless. Each day, without morphine, threatened withdrawal. Each day with morphine deepened her dependency. Here, Personal stakes collide with societal neglect. An adolescent imprisoned by biology, circumstance, and policy alike. Yet the revelation deepens further. Yes, streets became theaters of petty crime and violence. Yes, asylums absorbed the afflicted. But no, these phenomena were not merely moral failings. They were predictable outcomes of a system unprepared for chemical dependence. Contemporary newspaper accounts often portrayed addicts as villains or curiosities, ignoring the medical testimony. Coroner's inquests from 1870 to 1875 show recurring patterns. Overdose, exposure, malnutrition, often accompanied by minor criminal acts. Dr. John Clendon, writing in 1875, emphasized that addiction compromised judgment to the extent that law enforcement frequently misread desperation as intent. The societal misunderstanding, compounded by sensationalist reporting, created a parallel threat. Addiction became both a cause of crime and a justification for repression. Mounting obstacles compounded the crisis. With opiates cheap and widely available, pharmacies sold laudanum openly, while illicit morphine flowed from small workshops. The supply far outpaced medical oversight. Families relied on addicts for income or care, perpetuating cycles of dependency. In Bethnal Green, authorities noted recurring instances where children delivered morphine to parents, while mothers coerced daughters into prostitution to fund the habit. The ticking clock of withdrawal, combined with the unknown threat of law enforcement, forced impossible choices: feed the habit or feed the child, risk arrest or endure tremors, provide comfort or meet societal expectations. By 1876, a grim pattern emerged. The streets, hospitals, and courts formed an interconnected network where addiction, crime, and mental instability fed one another. Public perception labeled participants as morally degenerate. Yet the archival evidence tells a more nuanced story. Police diaries, asylum registers, and hospital letters illustrate a continuum. Desperation, compulsive acts, institutionalization. Each consequence, from a smashed window to a motherless child, was traceable to the unseen architecture of chemical dependency. Ironic reversal abounded. The more society punished, the more the streets incubated the very chaos authorities claimed to abhor. Within months, reformers began to intervene, though not always effectively. Charitable societies initiated outpatient care, yet resources were limited, and social stigma remained pervasive. By the following spring, the East End still teemed with shadows of desperate figures. Women with lined faces, children with hollow eyes, men shaking under the weight of withdrawal. Simultaneously, legal authorities tightened penalties for petty theft and street brawls, unaware that enforcement alone could not break the cycle. The parallel threat persisted. Addiction, poverty, and criminalization interlocked, each amplifying the other. But the ultimate question lingered, unresolved. Could the city distinguish between crime and illness, or were addicts forever trapped in the liminal space between moral failure and medical emergency? The answer would dictate the shape of public policy, the fate of families, and the rhythm of street life for decades to come. For every arrest and asylum admission, for every newspaper headline proclaiming vice and villainy, the human stories continued to unfold quietly in shadowed corridors, alleyways, and lodging rooms, demanding a reckoning that society had yet to meet. And as the fog thickened over the Thames that winter, it carried the echoes of desperation, an inescapable tension, pulling the narrative inexorably forward toward the next chapter of addiction's unfolding impact. The prescriptions arrived like rain in a drought, steady, unremarkable, almost routine. Morphine in measured doses, laudanum for the nerves, bottles labeled with careful script. But each pill, each teaspoon, carried a hidden weight, a compulsion that neither patient nor doctor fully understood. That same fog of uncertainty, which had turned the streets into theaters of desperation, now infiltrated the offices of physicians. Addiction was not yet a medical category, but a side effect, an inconvenience, a puzzle to be managed with repeated doses rather than inquiry. While families blamed the streets and courts blamed the poor, the medical establishment quietly fed the cycle, handing tools of dependency over with authority and reassurance. In 1871, Dr. Thomas Mallory, a general practitioner in Bethnal Green, kept meticulous ledgers of his patients' requests for laudanum. Among them was Sarah H., a seamstress of 28, whose trembling hands betrayed nights without sleep and mornings begun with the bitter taste of opiate tinctures. Mallory's ledger shows entries almost daily: 1 dram here, 2 drams there, alongside small doses of chloroform to manage headaches or menstrual pain. To the casual observer, these were routine treatments. To Sarah, they were lifelines, the only relief from the aches of poverty and exhaustion. But they were also the first thread in a rope that would slowly tighten around her autonomy. The stakes were both immediate and enduring. Each dose relieved pain, but deepened dependence. Every visit normalized consumption, and the law offered no oversight for this quiet epidemic. The mystery within the ledger raises a question. Did physicians know the harm they were inflicting, or were they themselves trapped in ignorance and convenience? Consider Dr. Charles Fenwick of Whitechapel, who, in 1873, testified to the Royal Medical Society that laudanum was a harmless adjunct to domestic medicine when used properly. Yet Fenwick's own case notes tell a different story. In March of that year, he recorded treating a young man, George P., for nervous agitation, prescribing morphine thrice daily. Within weeks, George returned, hands shaking, skin sallow, reporting that he could not sleep without the medication. Fenwick increased the dose. The streets whispered rumors of addicts lined outside chemists at dawn, yet within the respectable offices of doctors, the epidemic remained invisible. The unseen threat was not violence or theft. It was dependency masquerading as care. Yes, physicians treated pain and distress. But no, their treatments were not benign. Contemporary sources, including journals like The Lancet and the British Medical Journal, reveal an underlying tension between the promise of modern medicine and its unintended consequences. Dr. George Johnson wrote in 1874 that morphine offers comfort to the afflicted, while elsewhere documenting cases where patients spiraled into near-constant use. Personal stakes multiplied as doctors became reluctant enablers. Withholding a dose could provoke withdrawal, yet continuing prescriptions risked creating chronic addicts. A case from Bethlehem Hospital archives exemplifies this dilemma. Ellen W., admitted in late 1872, was prescribed laudanum for postnatal pain by her attending physician. 3 months later, she was noted to have habitual intoxication and required inpatient care. The hidden cost of care, once invisible, became unmistakable. Mounting obstacles compounded these choices. Pharmacists sold opiates openly, while legislation lagged behind practice. Patients often lied to secure prescriptions. Doctors relied on self-reported symptoms, and societal understanding of dependency was rudimentary. In 1875, Dr. Henry Cormack of London wrote, "We know not the limits of tolerance, nor the subtle ways the body craves beyond reason." This was not mere inexperience, it was systemic. Hospitals and clinics became both sanctuary and trap. Children observed their parents' daily dosages, absorbing habits and normalizing dependence. Wives recorded their husbands' prescriptions, fearing withdrawal more than poverty. The ticking clock of withdrawal and the unknown threat of chronic addiction created a feedback loop, one largely invisible to public authorities. The irony was stark. Physicians, armed with authority and scientific rationales, simultaneously alleviated suffering and perpetuated harm. A vivid example emerges from a coroner's inquest in 1873. A young clerk, Richard S., found dead in his garret, a bottle of morphine beside him, had received prescriptions from 3 separate doctors over 6 months. Yes, the medicine promised relief, but no, it was not neutral. It reshaped behavior, appetite, sleep, and ultimately, life itself. The revelation is that addiction was not simply a social problem or moral failing. It was a manufactured consequence of professional practice, compounded by social conditions, economic precarity, and regulatory blindness. The personal stakes could not be overstated. For every patient comforted, another slipped closer to collapse. Within months, the pattern became unmistakable. Reports to medical boards noted clusters of dependency, hospital admissions for withdrawal complications, and, occasionally, disciplinary hearings for overprescription. By the spring of 1876, the conversation began to shift from individual culpability to institutional accountability. Yet, even as critiques emerged, physicians faced difficult choices: deny care and risk patient suffering, or continue prescribing and nurture dependency. The mounting obstacles, limited knowledge, patient demand, social pressure, created an environment where addiction was almost inevitable. The ironic reversal lay in the fact that remedies intended to heal often doubled as mechanisms of harm. But the implications extended beyond individual cases. Chronic addiction fed street-level consequences: theft, petty crime, and the blurring of morality and illness. The parallel thread of social destabilization and professional complicity intensified. Within hospital archives, letters between physicians reveal anxiety over reputations, legal exposure, and ethical responsibility. One physician, writing in 1874, noted, "We act with kindness, yet the hands that soothe today may enslave tomorrow." The unknown threat, the slow, imperceptible creation of habitual addicts, loomed as both moral and medical dilemma, stretching across households and neighborhoods. By the end of 1876, reformers began to advocate for stricter oversight. Prescriptions to be recorded, quantities limited, medical boards empowered to investigate chronic overprescription. Yet the social, economic, and medical momentum of the habit made immediate change nearly impossible. Patients continued to arrive at clinics, sometimes traveling miles, seeking relief that might sustain life but would almost certainly shape it irrevocably. Doctors faced the ticking clock of disease, the personal stakes of patient suffering, and the hidden cost of every carefully measured dose. The consequence teasing forward was clear. Medical practice, once a refuge, had become both instrument and incubator of dependency. The streets, hospitals, and households formed a network of intertwined outcomes, with physicians as reluctant architects. And as physicians debated ethics and policy lagged behind practice, the next wave of societal reckoning waited just beyond the horizon. Within the shadow of consultation rooms and apothecary shelves, the question persisted: could knowledge, compassion, and regulation ever align to stop the cycle, or had the habit already claimed too many lives? The answer, unresolved, would pull the narrative inexorably toward the next stage of addiction's unfolding story. Smoke curled through the narrow alleys of Limehouse, thick and sweet, curling against the damp brick and seeping into every doorway. That same fog of opium that had once been framed as a private vice now took on a new guise: a social menace, a harbinger of moral decay, a threat to the very fabric of Victorian society. While physicians and newspapers debated the boundaries of addiction, the public imagination spun a darker story. Opium was no longer just a substance. It was a symbol, and in its shadow, suspicion of the Chinese community in London and beyond grew palpable. 3 years earlier, warnings about laudanum had stirred whispers of domestic peril. Now, the smoke itself seemed to carry treachery, linking a habit to an entire ethnic group in the popular consciousness. By 1870, Limehouse had become shorthand for danger. Sensationalist newspapers ran headlines like "The Yellow Menace," "Opium dens poison our youth," claiming that Chinese immigrants corrupted both bodies and morals. Social reformers like William Stead published exposés alleging that young English girls were lured into dens to sample opium under the supervision of foreign ruffians. The stakes were immediate. Families feared the loss of virtue and health. Politicians feared riots, and the press thrived on scandal. A vivid scene emerges from 1871 court records. 11-year-old Mary P., trembling and pale, was found near a den on Commercial Road, clutching a tiny porcelain pipe, her fingers sticky with opium residue. The account doesn't merely record the discovery. It frames it as evidence of a cultural and racial threat, the child made simultaneously victim and warning. But what those reports obscured was the complex reality. Many dens were operated by English proprietors, and opium use was often a private indulgence rather than an orchestrated menace. Yes, the fear was real, but the narrative was constructed. Anti-Chinese sentiment provided a convenient villain for anxieties about urbanization, industrial labor, and the apparent degeneration of the lower classes. In 1872, the Social Science Association published a report citing 124 arrests linked to opium, attributing nearly all cases to Chinese involvement, despite municipal records showing that over 40% of users were native-born Londoners. The mismatch between perception and reality fueled a moral panic. The unknown threat of addiction became entangled with visible difference, with skin color, language, and foreign customs conflated with danger. By portraying opium as both poison and proof of foreign corruption, newspapers mobilized fear while masking the structural inequalities, poverty, overcrowding, poor sanitation, that truly underpinned the problem. No, the story was not simple, and the stakes went beyond headlines. Historians examining Home Office archives note that Victorian anxieties about degeneration were both medical and racial. Doctors like Dr. Ernest Hart argued that opium weakens the Anglo-Saxon constitution and warned that Chinese dens served as incubators for moral and physical decline. A memorandum from the Metropolitan Police in 1873 described surveillance of 5 dens in Limehouse, noting that the operators are principally Chinese, though patrons are often English laborers, artisans, and clerks. The revelation complicates the myth. Addiction was a social problem, not an ethnic conspiracy, but the framing created a feedback loop of fear, legislation, and marginalization. The personal stakes were human. Families internalized anxiety, children were removed from homes under suspicion, and communities faced both prejudice and policing. The ironic reversal lay in the consequences of these narratives. Measures intended to curb harm often worsened it. In 1874, the Metropolitan Board of Works considered closing dens outright, which drove consumption into private spaces, making surveillance and intervention more difficult. Meanwhile, journalists and reformers continued to publish lurid stories, ensuring that public perception remained inflamed even as actual opium-related crime and illness were poorly understood. The hidden cost of moral panic was not just the alienation of Chinese residents. It was the stigmatization of ordinary addicts, the misdirection of police resources, and the amplification of social fears that had little to do with opium itself. In October of 1875, the trial of Ling, proprietor of a commercial road opium den, became a media sensation. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tobacco and tension, reporters scribbling feverishly, capturing every gesture. Witnesses claimed that young men and boys were drawn into dens by foreign cunning, yet official testimony revealed that many had sought out opium voluntarily, often using it to self-medicate for chronic ailments. The yes but contradiction crystallized here. The den was real, the fear was palpable, yet the attribution of moral danger to a racialized other was largely fabricated. Primary sources from the coroner's records underscore the subtle complexity. Opium deaths occurred across neighborhoods, and the majority of habitual users were British-born. The narrative of racialized corruption, however, overshadowed these facts, shaping policy and public discourse for decades. By 1876, the moral panic began to intersect with legislative action. Parliament debated bills restricting opium sales, often citing Chinese dens as justification. London's newspapers amplified every arrest and anecdote, while philanthropic societies pressured for closures of what they called contagious spaces of vice. Within these months, multiple threads converged: racial prejudice, medical uncertainty, journalistic sensationalism, and genuine public concern about addiction. The mounting obstacles for reformers were both social and epistemological. How to address substance abuse without reinforcing xenophobia, and how to distinguish between moral panic and legitimate risk. The parallel threats of ethnic fear and real addiction reinforced each other, creating a climate in which both policy and perception were skewed. But the propulsion of fear extended far beyond London. In 1877, stories of Chinese opium dens reached Manchester and Liverpool, often with embellishments that painted immigrants as subversive and predatory. Communities that had little interaction with Chinese residents now absorbed the same anxieties, repeating tales of corruption, moral decay, and the opium curse. Within months, Anti-Chinese sentiment influenced housing policy, policing priorities, and even schooling, linking urban planning and public health to racialized fear. And while the dens themselves remained small, the narrative expanded exponentially, demonstrating how moral panic could leap beyond the source and reshape an entire social landscape. This moment would echo decades later, when similar patterns of scapegoating intersected with new substances, new communities, and new anxieties. The consequences were not abstract. Legislation, policing, and social ostracization created lasting disparities that outlived the immediate fear of opium. What happened next would entangle moral judgment, scientific authority, and racial prejudice in ways that would shape both addiction discourse and immigration policy. By the following spring, the image of the opium-smoking Chinese had become a fixture in public imagination, a symbol of both danger and degeneration. And yet, behind the headlines, the ordinary human stories, the daily dependence, the quiet suffering, the social vulnerability, remained largely unseen. The tension persisted. Could society confront addiction without projecting its fears onto a convenient other? The answer hung in the smoky streets of Limehouse, unresolved, waiting to unfold. The clang of a hospital bell echoed down narrow corridors, mingling with the cries of patients struggling through withdrawals that no one had fully understood. That same desperation that had haunted families and fueled moral panic now entered the hands of those claiming to cure it. By 1878, opium and laudanum addiction had shifted from private vice to public problem, and society demanded solutions. While newspapers painted the addicted as degenerate or foreign, doctors, clergy, and reformers began to promise salvation. Yet the remedies were often as brutal as the habit itself. 3 months earlier, the Metropolitan Asylum on Old Street had admitted 40 men and women, some barely able to stand, for a regimen that promised recovery but delivered terror, shaking the fragile line between treatment and torment. The question loomed: could addiction ever be subdued, or was society merely trading one form of suffering for another? Attempts at cure took multiple forms, each reflecting both the urgency and misunderstanding of the era. Cold turkey detox became a staple, often conducted without medical supervision. In January of 1879, hospital records detailed the case of Thomas H., a 32-year-old laborer, confined to a sparsely furnished room, his body racked by tremors and vomiting, denied any opium for weeks. The scene is visceral: coarse blankets soaked with sweat, nurses holding him down during convulsions, the metallic tang of blood from bitten lips hanging in the air. For physicians, the logic was simple: remove the substance, and the body would reset. But the hidden cost was immediate and brutal. Many patients relapsed within days, some dying from dehydration or heart failure. Religious intervention offered another path. Reverend Samuel Clive of Hackney preached nightly vigils, claiming prayer could cleanse both soul and body. In one account from March 1880, he records 60 attendees, all clutching small Bibles, faces pale and sunken. He described visions of angels guiding the afflicted. But in practice, these services often masked physical suffering with moral rhetoric, framing withdrawal as spiritual warfare rather than a physiological crisis. Sanatoriums, the so-called temples of reform, promised controlled environments and expert supervision. Yet they too revealed the era's misunderstanding. The East End Retreat, founded in 1876, claimed a structured program: diet, exercise, counseling, and stage deprivation. A visitor's diary from April 1878 describes rigid timetables. Patients rose at dawn, forced walks along cobbled streets. Opium doses reduced incrementally under strict observation. But the practice concealed significant contradictions. Yes, some regained function temporarily, but no, the institutions did not account for psychological dependency or social pressures that awaited outside the walls. Admission statistics suggest the hidden reality. Of 120 patients treated between 1876 and 1880, only 18 remained abstinent 6 months post-release. The revelation was grim. The very tools of control reinforced suffering, the sanatorium's walls containing not just bodies but fear and stigma. The human element magnifies this failure. Mary J., a 24-year-old laundress, entered the East End retreat in 1877, clutching her baby. Her withdrawal began with nausea and night terrors. Staff, ill-prepared for maternal distress, separated mother and child for safety. Diaries preserved in the London Metropolitan Archives describe her screaming for hours, a cry echoing down empty corridors, the infant wrapped in coarse linen, unsoothed. Here, the yes but dynamic emerges. Yes, the retreat sought rehabilitation, but could not reconcile addiction with humanity, enforcing protocols that ignored individual need. Primary sources from nursing logs reveal a pattern repeated across multiple institutions. Patients disciplined for inadequate progress, relapses treated as moral failings rather than medical realities. Cause and effect were twisted. Punishment for perceived weakness often worsened dependency, fueling cycles of shame, isolation, and despair. Experts of the era debated these outcomes with little consensus. Dr. William Stoddart, writing in 1881, argued that absolute abstinence is the only cure, yet acknowledged that mortality and relapse rates were staggering. Reports from the charity organization Society highlighted the hidden costs of rigid interventions. Patients emerged weakened, psychologically scarred, often returning to the very streets where addiction had first taken hold. Meanwhile, religious reformers lamented the spiritual peril, unaware that their zeal sometimes amplified physical harm. The revelation is clear. Early treatment was less a science than a social assertion of control, reflecting anxieties about morality, order, and the boundaries of acceptable suffering. In attempting to impose structure, society confronted the difficult choice of balancing care against coercion, and often failed. Mounting obstacles compounded the challenge. Families distrusted institutions after seeing loved ones emerge cured, yet hollowed, and physicians faced public scrutiny for failures that were, in part, unavoidable. Newspapers reported escapes from sanatoriums, deaths during detox, and violent outbursts, creating a climate where innovation and caution collided. The ticking clock was relentless. Opium dependence continued to spread, the population of users growing, while authorities struggled to scale interventions that remained harsh and inconsistent. The ironic reversal became apparent. The more fervently society sought control, the more it exposed the inadequacy of its methods. The personal stakes, health, dignity, family cohesion, remained high, tangible in the trembling hands of patients and the haunted eyes of caretakers. But forward momentum arrived in unexpected forms. By late 1880, a small cohort of reformers began experimenting with what would later become tapering protocols, slowly reducing doses under observation rather than enforcing abrupt deprivation. Documentation from the East London Infirmary details cases where patients received measured laudanum reductions, combined with nutrition and light exercise, yielding higher short-term survival and modest improvements in post-treatment functionality. The parallel threat of relapse, however, persisted. Even the most cautious programs could not shield patients from the streets, employment pressures, or persistent social stigma. Within months, the lessons of failure and innovation began to converge, suggesting a future where care might balance empathy and control, but the path remained uncertain. By the following spring, public attention began to shift. Charitable societies promoted outpatient guidance. Clergy encouraged supportive rather than punitive measures, and medical journals debated the first empirically informed strategies. And yet, the tension remained. Could society manage addiction without repeating cycles of cruelty, coercion, and stigma? The harsh corridors of the East End retreat and the screaming nights of Mary J. lingered as evidence that early efforts, no matter how well-intentioned, carried hidden costs and moral hazards. The story of cure and control was incomplete, a hinge on which the next chapter of social, medical, and personal struggle would pivot. Somewhere beyond the city walls, patients continued to suffer, institutions recalibrated, and society confronted the inevitable. The path from dependency to recovery would demand both innovation and humility, or else history would repeat its most brutal lessons. The glow of the opium lamp, once a symbol of sophistication and quiet contemplation, flickered uneasily against the walls of drawing rooms and dens alike. That glow, which had long connoted elegance and intellectual refinement, now cast shadows of suspicion and fear. By the mid-1880s, what had been accepted as a gentleman's indulgence or a physician's remedy was increasingly seen as a social liability. Newspapers chronicled harrowing tales of addicts collapsing in alleyways, their habits traced to foreign suppliers and mysterious dens tucked behind bustling city streets. 3 years earlier, physicians had argued for laudanum's medicinal virtues. Now, regulatory boards and temperance societies demanded accountability. The cultural tide had shifted. While the addicts themselves remained ensnared, the public perception of opium, the aura of respectability that had once protected it, was unraveling, leaving users exposed not just to personal ruin, but to a legal and moral judgment that would redefine them in society's eyes. The unraveling began quietly, in courtrooms, parliamentary chambers, and newspaper offices. Early cases of public intoxication, once dismissed as personal weakness, were now prosecuted with growing severity. In 1877, the Metropolitan Police reported 243 arrests linked directly to opium dens in London's East End. By 1883, that number had more than doubled. Sensational reporting fanned the flames. The Illustrated Police News described dens as hellish retreats where men and women, of all classes, descend into delirium and decay. A vivid account from 1882 recounts Inspector James Hartley raiding a shop in Limehouse. The air thick with acrid smoke, the floor littered with paraphernalia, addicts slumped in tatters of clothing, eyes glazed and unseeing. Hartley's notes emphasize both the horror of the scene and the tension in the streets. Residents feared violence, theft, and disease. The question loomed: could society reclaim control over a substance once woven into the routines of daily life, or was opium's fall inevitable? Complications arose from the intersection of law, commerce, and class. Many addicts had legitimate prescriptions. Pharmacists had supplied laudanum freely, often without record or restriction. In 1881, a parliamentary inquiry revealed that 67% of opium sold in London's pharmacies was purchased by women seeking relief from coughs, menstrual pain, or nervous disorders. This raised a difficult choice for lawmakers: criminalize users whose habits originated in medical advice, or allow continued access at the risk of wider social harm. Meanwhile, political figures leveraged public fear to advance racialized agendas. Opium, long associated with Chinese immigrants, became a shorthand for degeneration, moral decay, and foreign threat, a fact that complicated reform efforts and fueled xenophobic legislation. In 1879, the first Opium Den Suppression Act authorized police raids and closure orders, signaling a shift from tolerance to active intervention. But enforcement was uneven, revealing the mounting obstacles facing those who sought to contain a habit that had infiltrated both private and public life. The revelation of opium's fall extended beyond legal controls to social perception. Yes, the dens were closed and the first regulations passed. But no, this did not eliminate use. It merely relocated into shadows, private homes, and clandestine networks. Primary sources illustrate this transformation. Diaries from 1884 recount addicts hiding in attics, consuming laudanum in secrecy, while neighbors whispered of those lost to vice, without understanding the physiological grip of the drug. Experts such as Dr. Thomas Oliver documented a dual reality. Medicalization had legitimized addiction for decades, yet stigma and criminalization now converged, casting addicts as both morally suspect and socially dangerous. Evidence from hospital records supports this. Admissions for opium-related complications increased by 28% between 1880 and 1885, suggesting that regulation controlled visibility more than consumption. Cause and effect intertwined. The very measures meant to protect society amplified shame, isolation, and the difficulty of treatment. The legal and cultural shift produced paradoxes. Women, previously seen as innocent consumers of medicinal laudanum, were now framed as susceptible to moral corruption. Men, once discreet users in clubs and offices, were recast as criminals and degenerates. Expert testimony before Parliament repeatedly noted the hidden cost of this transformation. Families shamed, livelihoods destroyed, and the public perception of addiction hardened. Yet this shift also accelerated broader understanding. The framing of opium as a social problem, rather than a private vice or merely a medical curiosity, allowed public health advocates to argue for more systematic interventions, eventually laying the groundwork for modern treatment paradigms. At the same time, the ticking clock of public anxiety intensified. Newspapers, reform societies, and politicians demanded immediate results, even as the complexity of addiction outpaced society's ability to manage it. Mounting obstacles extended to commerce and international relations. Importers and pharmacists resisted restrictions that threatened profit. Colonial administrations navigated the tension between trade and control. By 1885, tension surfaced in debates over Chinese immigration, opium importation, and labor exploitation, revealing a parallel threat: the intersection of addiction, race, and imperial policy. The irony was stark. Opium, once a marker of elite sophistication, now symbolized disorder and danger at every level of society. Personal stakes were no less acute. Diaries preserved in the British Library recount men losing employment after police raids, women abandoned by families, and entire neighborhoods stigmatized, a human cost that blurred the lines between law, morality, and compassion. Forward momentum arose from incremental reform and shifting norms. The 1890 Pharmacy Act codified tighter control of opiates, requiring documentation of sales, limiting distribution, and formally criminalizing unlicensed supply. Medical journals promoted careful prescribing, and temperance societies used public education campaigns to stigmatize recreational use. But the battle was far from over. Underground networks thrived, cultural memory of opium dens lingered in literature and folklore, and the stigma attached to addiction hardened. Within months, court cases multiplied, the press continued to sensationalize the dangers, and addicts navigated a landscape of legal peril and social ostracism. Foreshadowing the century-long trajectory of drug policy, these years illustrate how respectability can erode not just from public outrage, but from the collision of law, commerce, and culture. By the turn of the decade, opium's decline from respectable indulgence to social menace seemed inexorable. Public spaces were policed, prescriptions monitored, and a moralistic lens reframed addiction as a symptom of weakness and foreign influence. Yet, the unresolved tension persisted. Regulation could not erase desire, nor could social stigma cure dependency. Families continued to conceal use, addicts migrated into shadows, and reformers debated the balance between punishment and care. What happened next would shape the trajectory of drug control, public health, and societal judgment for decades. The fall of opium's respectability had begun as a legal and cultural correction, but it also raised an enduring question. Could a society punish the habit without punishing the human? The shadows of those old dens, the lingering scent of laudanum, and the newspaper's alarmed headlines all pressed forward, demanding an answer that history had yet to provide. The smell of laudanum lingered in the air long after the lamps went out. That faint, bitter scent clung to the corridors of hospitals, the shelves of pharmacies, and even the corners of private drawing rooms, a ghostly reminder of a habit that had once been both accepted and invisible. By the early 20th century, the Victorian fascination with opium had dissipated, replaced by anxiety, legislation, and moral scrutiny. What had once been a socially sanctioned indulgence now bore the weight of stigma, its users labeled degenerate or criminal. 3 decades of policing, temperance campaigns, and public outcry had left traces in culture, medicine, and law, traces that would extend far beyond London's gaslit streets. The shadow of those years was not just in the addicts themselves, but in the very framework of how Britain would come to understand, regulate, and morally judge psychoactive substances for generations. The transformation of public perception began in subtle, cumulative ways. By 1905, opium and its derivatives were no longer casually dispensed in pharmacies. Sales were increasingly monitored, prescriptions logged, and users scrutinized. Legal milestones, such as the Pharmacy Act of 1868 and its subsequent amendments, had codified control, but the enforcement was uneven and dependent on local authorities' willingness to intervene. In Limehouse, for instance, the small shop run by Ling, once a hub of quiet indulgence, became a flashpoint for raids and newspaper sensation. The Daily Chronicle in 1903 described the scene. A half-dozen men slumped in low chairs, pale and trembling, surrounded by clay pipes and amber bottles, the air thick with acrid smoke, children peering through shutters, wide-eyed at the spectacle. The public appetite for scandal fed policy. Politicians and reformers seized the moment to argue for national regulation, invoking fears not only of moral decay, but of racial and social contamination. The stakes were high. Failing to control opium threatened public order, undermined faith in medical authority, and risked perpetuating addiction across classes. Yet the complexity of the problem, how to distinguish therapeutic use from abuse or habit from crime, remained largely unsolved. Into this shifting landscape stepped figures whose choices would leave enduring marks. Dr. William Stokes of St. Bartholomew's Hospital, writing in 1902, warned that addiction is not a matter of will alone, but a physiological transformation that challenges both doctor and legislator. Meanwhile, reformers such as Lady Mary Montagu, campaigning through pamphlets and temperance meetings, conflated addiction with moral weakness and foreign influence, framing the opium user as a social threat. Tension mounted when medical and moral authorities clashed. Should physicians retain discretion in prescribing opiates, or should law dictate rigid boundaries? The answer shaped the contours of drug policy for decades. One vivid episode illustrates this tension. In 1908, an inspector raided a small apothecary in Birmingham. On the counter, neat rows of laudanum vials gleamed like tiny amber sentinels. Behind the counter, Miss Eleanor Price, a chemist's assistant, trembled as she was asked to account for sales dating back 5 years. Documentation was patchy. Some customers had prescriptions, others did not. The raid ended in fines, but the cultural message was clear. Opium was no longer a neutral commodity. It was a regulated, scrutinized, and morally charged substance, and those associated with it were under watch. The revelation of Victorian opium's legacy emerges most clearly when tracing its influence on policy and culture. Yes, the laws reduced open use and public consumption, but no, they did not eliminate dependence or secrecy. Instead, addiction retreated into private homes, hidden corners, and private correspondence. Hospital records from 1910 reveal that London's General Infirmary admitted 152 patients for opium-related illnesses in a single year, a figure that underlines the persistence of the problem despite regulation. The very practices that had once legitimized opium use, medical prescription, domestic discretion, and social acceptance, were now implicated in the creation of stigma. As historian Peter Field noted, the Victorian system of liberal prescription and limited oversight inadvertently created a moral template. Addicts were both victims and transgressors, deserving of pity and censure simultaneously. This duality carried forward into British cultural imagination. Literature, theater, and journalism repeatedly cast opium users as tragic, morally ambiguous figures, caught between desire, illness, and societal condemnation. Medical ethics, too, bore the imprint. The debates over how far a physician should intervene, or when legal oversight should constrain therapeutic practice, set precedents that resonate today. The early 20th century discourse on laudanum prescriptions foreshadowed modern considerations around opioid management, patient autonomy, and the responsibility of healthcare professionals. Archival materials, including letters from Dr. Charles Norman of the London Hospital, argue that doctors faced the impossible choice of alleviating suffering while preventing ruin, an ethical tension that echoes in contemporary debates over prescription opioids. The personal stakes were immediate. Families fractured, livelihoods endangered, reputations destroyed, and yet the lessons learned informed emerging systems of controlled substances, public health oversight, and addiction treatment frameworks. Even as laws tightened, the human element, the private suffering of users, the moral judgment of society, remained central, shaping the narrative of addiction that would persist for generations. The shadows that lingered were not merely historical. They accelerated into the modern era. By the 1920s, Britain's approach to drug policy codified both caution and control, with regulatory mechanisms and criminal penalties informed directly by Victorian anxieties. Public health campaigns drew on the cultural memory of opium dens and lamplit parlors, portraying addiction as both a physiological hazard and a moral failing. Literary depictions. Thomas de Quincey's earlier works read now in cautionary contexts, and contemporary novels depicting addicts as fallen figures reinforced this dual image. At the same time, the personal stakes remained high. Physicians and policymakers had to navigate the tension between legal enforcement, ethical care, and social expectation. The unknown threat of concealed dependence persisted. Addiction did not vanish with legislation, and clandestine networks ensured that opiates remained a hidden yet persistent part of urban life. The irony was unmistakable. What had been an emblem of refinement became a cautionary tale, and the very strategies designed to protect society sometimes deep in the shadows they sought to eliminate. Within months of new legislation, opium's decline in visibility coincided with an acceleration of public moral discourse. Temperance societies, reformist newspapers, and parliamentary committees combined to redefine addiction not as a private failing, but as a societal problem requiring coordinated intervention. By the 1930s, medical training incorporated awareness of dependency. Physicians were instructed in prescription limits, and the legal framework codified offenses and penalties. Yet the lingering question remained: how could society balance empathy for the addicted individual with the imperative to regulate and prevent harm? The Victorian experience, encoded into law, culture, and ethics, provided a template, but one with unresolved tensions and enduring consequences. Stories of addicts hiding laudanum in cupboards, families whispering about shameful habits, and communities policing behavior continued to resonate, forming a cultural memory that shaped both policy and perception. And so, the shadows lingered. They persisted in the journals of doctors, in legislative debates, and in the literature that grappled with moral ambiguity and human frailty. They whispered in courtrooms where addicts faced judgment, and in homes where families wrestled with secrecy and despair. These shadows would echo into the next century, informing drug control, shaping public attitudes toward dependency, and coloring the ethical frameworks within which physicians operated. The legacy of Victorian opium addiction was neither erased nor confined. It had been woven into the fabric of British society, leaving questions that demanded resolution. Could regulation truly protect, or would it merely drive addiction deeper into concealment? The answer, poised on the edge of history, would soon emerge, and it would change everything.